Hello and welcome to a Monday Night Football Showdown edition. Jimmy Garoppolo at Jared Goff. My name is Adam Levitan, filling in for Cody today, who is away, joined by Gary Hartman and Mark Dankenbring. Gary, how's it going today?
It's good. Obviously miss my boy Cody, but happy to be joining you fine gentlemen. Mark, I think we've been working together for like 3 years now. I think this is the first DFS show we've ever been on together. I know we've been on like live streams and stuff for NBA, but I think so, which is about time.
Yeah, that might be. And I'm glad to hear you're doing all right, Gary, because that Giants loss yesterday, as someone who bet Jets win total unders and them to miss the playoffs, I was rooting hard for the Giants, and to see the fashion that they lost was brutal for me. So for you as a laundry bro,
I'm numb.
I'm glad you're
fully
right.
numb. I'm completely numb at this point to anything Giants devastating relationship. You should hear my brothers are like in freshmen in college and they're devastated. But me, I'm like, oh, you'll get used to it.
Jesus,
it's been a decade.
Tell these kids to get a life. My God. Okay. We are here to talk about tonight's Showdown slate as usual. Interesting game, I think, in the fact that the Lions play so much better at home, but the Raiders are getting Jimmy Garoppolo back from his back injury. We've also had all the Devontae Adams squeaky wheel stuff. We have Hunter Renfrow trade rumors. We have David Montgomery still expected out from a high level. Gary, how do you think about this game tonight?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to look at this one and not get excited about being Lions heavy, especially when you consider that there's some value on that side, mostly in the form of Jahmyr Gibbs, who's pretty underpriced, I think, for what the role that we expect him to have here. Obviously, Raiders have struggled so far this season. The Lions have looked like a premier NFL team, especially at home, and you'll see it in the roster construction that the field will probably go pretty Lions heavy. You could see 32% on 4-2s, even up to 15% on 5-1s. And then, as usual, a lot of the field will trickle to the 3-3s, which makes sense. So if you want to flip this on its head, there's some punt plays on the Raiders. If you want to go in that direction, it's something you can consider. But definitely feel like the Lions side will be heard from here tonight.
Yeah, I want to bring up some of our sim analysis for this slate. And this is very initial sim analysis for the slate. It will update when we post on the site. But yeah, I'll bring this up, Mark, if you have any thoughts on captain tonight or anything else on this slate. Let me see if I can tech lord this.
Yeah. Well, generally, yes. I mean, the Lions at home, like you mentioned, have been really offensive force this year. Jared Goff, his home and road splits, especially when he's playing in the dome versus outdoors, super strong. So I feel like we can be confident in the Lions offense. And then when you look at the Raiders, they're just like historically condensed on offense with how many targets are going to Devontae, Jacoby Myers, and Josh Jacobs. And now Michael Mayer is mixed in a little bit, but it's still extremely condensed. So it's a fun slate for sure. When looking at it, I do think it's a night that like Jahmyr Gibbs should crush. So I'm on the chalk train there and definitely interested to pick Gary's GPP bro brain about areas we can pivot tonight.
So I just want to be clear, like last night with Gerald Everett out, I played 3 teams. There were 3 Donald Parham captain teams. If you guys have been following for a long time, you know how I feel about Donald Parham, and it still wasn't good enough. I had 3 really good teams, but it still wasn't good enough to win. And I guess my overall point is something that Cody's talked about a lot, is that it is somewhat rare for these dusty plays, even when they play well, to be the optimal captain, right? And that's like so important to me, is to think about once I know who I want to be captain, it's so much easier to make the lineups, right? And you can see a lot of that stuff in the sim stuff we've been doing and understanding how correlation works. Picking the captain, I think, is just so important. So what I think the sim stuff has shown me, at least, you see here in the bottom left quadrant, like, yeah, all these guys are relatively fine. You can make a case that Josh Reynolds, Jameson Williams, the kickers, something like that is an okay captain, but it's so rare. And in some of the stuff that I'm playing, the smaller field stuff, it just doesn't strike me that it's typically good to do that. Now, there are exceptions. Remember the Michael Gallup versus the Chargers slate. On this graph here, Michael Gallup was like off the chart, like on our stuff, like all the way up here effectively, because on the specific slate and his ownership, it allowed you to get in so much other stuff. But generally speaking, the players that are going to be the best captains, we think, are guys like Amon-Ra, Devontae, obviously Gibbs and Jacobs on this slate. And this is just for ownership as that gets affected as well. Cody will be updating the ownership. But yeah, I just want to give a little rant there on captain selection and get some tilt off my chest that Donald Parham hit last night, and I had Dicker, and I had Eckler, and I had everything, and it still wasn't good enough because you really needed a different captain than Parham, even though he played well. So yeah, I don't know. Any response to that, Gary? I know, like, when we just like, I feel like sometimes we gloss over the captain stuff too much.
No, it's a good point, and it's a conversation Cody and I have been having now since that Gallup slate, and even a little bit before that. It's, it depends on the game environment when you're trying to jam all those studs in. And like tonight, theoretically, you could try to jam in Gibbs and Amon-Ra and Devontae and Josh Jacobs and just punt at captain, but you still need that raw score from the captain. So the argument with that Gallup game was, okay, the target share's there. The role is still there. He's out on the field. You can arguably see a 20-point night where if you get 20 points out of him, you jam in all the studs, you're feeling good about that. This does not strike me as a game where I'm getting, I don't know, I guess you could say like a Josh Reynolds, or you need someone even less than that, like a 2,800 guy to jam in all those other guys. And sure, you can luck yourself into 2 touchdowns and then you're jamming all those studs who hit their floors and boom. But that's really a rare outcome. And it's something we talk about all the time in main slate GPPs. You need the raw ceiling there, and you especially need it when your score is getting doubled up at that captain spot. So I agree with your general sentiment there that I think that's more of a rarity to take that punt captain than a norm.
Yeah. Last thing I'd say on this graph here, basically the guys below the dotted line are over-owned relative to how often we think that they will be captain. Quarterbacks are on there so much, not as much like Lamar and Josh Allen types, but quarterbacks like this, Goff and Garoppolo specifically, are below this line so often because when they have a big game, their receivers have bigger games, right? Every time that Jared Goff completes a pass to Amon-Ra, it's worth way more to Amon-Ra than it is to Jared Goff. So when Jared Goff has these huge games, it's more likely that a receiver will be the optimal captain, not Goff himself. And that's somewhat reflected there in this graph. Not trying to be all tech bro on everyone, just thought that this was an interesting thing here to share. Let me see if I can tech lord back to the other page now.
I do want to mention too with Goff, like we've seen this Raiders defense play a lot of kind of like too high shell coverage where they're trying to force everything underneath. And that really sets up, especially on DraftKings, to a situation where like a lot of Goff's pass catchers can theoretically get there. And Goff, as you mentioned, is kind of racking up not as many yards as the completions would indicate. So I do think it's interesting to kind of fade Goff and load up more on the Detroit skill players, just given how the Raiders defense has been playing this year, and Detroit's, in the red zone, their pass rate over expectation has been the lowest in the league. Like they've been running it ad nauseum in the red zone. So I think fading Goff is certainly interesting.
Yeah. And that brings us to quarterback. I think that's a good point. And certainly at these ownerships, right? 9% captain on Goff, 62 total. I think a fade is certainly in play there. What Mark is alluding to is a lot of completions does not necessarily mean that Goff will be a good play, would make wide receivers and pass catchers better plays here. So yeah, I think Goff is fine, but I probably will be underweight Goff. Gary, what do you think about Jimmy Garoppolo tonight as he returns from his back injury?
Yeah, on Goff, I just want to say, like, I think I'm still very interested in him in the flex, especially in Lions heavy lineups. I just think underweight on captain is a very reasonable place to go. I think Cody hit the Jimmy G side of it pretty well in the article, where usually Cody is looking at both quarterbacks as cash game priorities. I don't even think he feels that way necessarily about Garoppolo tonight. 9,400, probably a little bit too pricey for what we've seen from him so far this year. If you want to buy into the Raiders offense and how condensed it is, and if you're going an Adams or Myers captain, I would be boosting Garoppolo in my flex in those instances, but I don't think he's a priority by any means at flex or captain tonight. I just think he is what he is. Now, game script should maybe be in their favor. They're 7-point dogs, 46.5, I think, over under. So if you want to play this game up, he's probably still somebody that you can get into your flex plenty, but he's not a priority for me tonight.
I think that's totally fair. One thing that I would say that I've been thinking about is they have been inept at running the football. I mean, absolutely inept. If I was coaching them, I'd just be like, screw it, man. Let's just start throwing the ball more. Josh Jacobs is at 2.9 yards per carry. I guess that could be fluky, small sample stuff, but we're going on 6 or 7 weeks now. Josh Jacobs is going to get there regardless with his usage. I'd rather see them throw it to the ball to Josh Jacobs 8 or 9 times today than try to jam him up the line. Mark, any other quarterback thoughts before we move on here?
Not a whole lot. Just as Gary mentioned, I think the game script that we're expecting as Lions, build an early lead and the Raiders are trying to chip their way back. So I think, just given that, I do kind of like Jimmy G, maybe a little more than it sounds like Gary did in the flex, but I just think like the offense, the way the Raiders are going to have offensive success tonight is through throwing the ball. So that's my lean there.
100%. Okay. The question of the slate, in my opinion, is how to handle Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs was left at 8,600, even though David Montgomery we're expecting out once again. Actually, I think officially ruled out already is David Montgomery. So you get this big Jahmyr Gibbs projection. And I didn't think they'd use Jahmyr Gibbs like this, but in both games that David Montgomery has been out, it has been workhorse Jahmyr Gibbs, run up the middle with Jahmyr Gibbs, and listen, like, he's an explosive guy. He's going to be okay, even if that's not his best suited role. He can always, though, bounce one to the outside. He can always catch a ton of balls. So it's hard to poke holes in Jahmyr Gibbs here. If you're playing higher stakes, smaller field stuff, ownership is going to be even higher than we have it. We have it 69% total, 17% captain. In small field, I could see it being even higher than that. So I think I need both your guys' takes on this one. How should we be handling Jahmyr Gibbs tonight? I'll start with Mark.
Well, coming in to the show, I was like, Jahmyr Gibbs just seems like a fantastic play. I mean, hard to get away from. So again, that's kind of my lean with the game. You mentioned just his workload has been really strong in the games without David Montgomery. He's played over 75% of the running back snaps. He's handled 28 of 38 running back carries and seen 11 of 13 running back targets. So really kind of any game script that the Lions see here, Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be out on the field and likely put in position to score fantasy points. And I mentioned, the Lions are the lowest pass rate over expectation team in the league in the red zone, which means they're running the ball as you get closer to the end zone, which is good signs for Jahmyr Gibbs. And kind of all the coaching comments from Dan Campbell is that they're willing to load him up. He's a week off his hamstring injury, another week removed from that. So I feel pretty confident here that Gibbs just has a great floor and is certainly like a really scary fade for me. I can see why the chalk is going to be incoming here.
Yeah, I guess, Gary, maybe we're better off talking, if you are going to go for a Gibbs fade, what does that look like? And then there's some line, and again, we'll post the sim stuff in the sim analysis on the site for anyone who is a subscriber later. That'll be updated, and I think we're going to probably have a boost on Gibbs ownership there, and he's going to start getting way, way closer to that dotted line that I showed at the beginning. So yeah, what are your Gibbs thoughts here, Gary?
So I think a fade on Gibbs looks like a fade in the captain spot. And I think you can kind of paint a picture where you still want, because the price is so good and the role is expected to be so good, matchup is so good, everything, you paint all that stuff. The reason that I would say, hey, maybe he doesn't have the ultimate highest ceiling on the slate is twofold. One, we saw him had 10 targets last week. They were playing from behind, right? The last time that game script that he, when he was the bell cow and they won that game, it was not nearly as much in the pass game, kind of using him to control the clock up the middle. Still think that's a great role for him. Touches galore. All that stuff's great. But in those scenarios, I don't mind going like a 4-2 Lions with Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers, and the captain. And maybe I get overweight that way. Game script's looking really, really nice for you from the Raiders throwing the ball, and you're still capturing all of that Jahmyr Gibbs floor and just saying, hey, maybe we don't run lucky on touchdowns. Maybe we don't run lucky on the pass game role, and we still need those raw points. We want him in the flex. So I'm not fading him overall for his total ownership. I don't think I'm doing that tonight, but I certainly would be okay taking a stand and coming in under on the captain side.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's totally fair. And by the way, we do have Gibbs with the highest ceiling on this slate in our projections, but not that much ahead of Amon-Ra or Devontae Adams. And I would even throw Jacoby Myers and Josh Jacobs into the mix there as guys that can threaten Jahmyr Gibbs as well. On the other side at running back, we get this massive Josh Jacobs usage, which he hasn't been able to do a lot with this year, other than the receiving game, where I think he's actually been really good. It's really been the running game where he's been struggling a ton. These are the kind of running backs, though, man, that I like to play. No matter what happens in this game, no matter what the game script is, no matter what their game plan is, Josh Jacobs is getting 15 to 20 touches or more, So I still think Josh Jacobs is awesome and can certainly threaten Jahmyr Gibbs here. Mark, how are you thinking about Jacobs tonight?
I'm a little worried about, again, just his efficiency given the lack of it we've seen this season. You mentioned 2.9 yards per carry is really rough. Evan in his matchups column had some nice notes on just like how unproductive he's been compared to expectation. He's minus 76% rushing yards versus expectation, which is the third lowest among 41 qualified backs. And then going against a rushing defense that's been really strong in the Lions. It's not like they're a weak unit that we can expect some regression in the efficiency department. So I'm definitely a little bit worried about his rushing output, but in terms of running backs and their receiving output, that's been super strong for Jacobs this year. So I think, we can feel decent about that, but overall, I don't love the outlook for Jacobs. Again, just been, inefficient back going against an efficient defense. So it's a little tough for me.
I think if you do go Jacobs captain, you need Raiders defense, or you don't need, but I would have Raiders defense in flex somewhere if I had Jacobs captain. I also think Amon-Ra St. Brown works really well with Jacobs captain teams. You get a lead through Jacobs, you get Jacobs smashing, you get into a more back and forth game there with Amon-Ra racking up a bunch of targets. Gary, anything else on running back before we move on?
No, I think, Jacobs, these kind of Jacobs spots where the total ownership is a little bit low for what the role is. I've been attacking in Showdown this year and has not necessarily been that successful in these game environments where they don't expect to have that much success on the ground. The Lions run D has been really good as well. I mean, the plus case on Jacobs is going to be through the air tonight too. So I don't mind getting Garoppolo in the flex and Jacobs captain lineups even. Because I think, if Jacobs is getting there, it's happening on both sides.
Yeah. And to be clear, if Jacobs was going to be owned at the Gibbs level, he wouldn't be a play, right? I just think because Jacobs is 41% total ownership, 8% captain, and we'll see, I think a lot of people, Matt says you guys should play Jacobs so I can win. I think a lot of people have, and nothing against Matt, I just think a lot of people think like that, and we might be able to get some lower than usual ownership here on Josh Jacobs. Move to wide receiver. Why don't we start on the Las Vegas side where we had the Davante Adams squeaky wheel, but it came with Brian Hoyer. Now we get Davante Adams squeaky wheel-ish with Jimmy Garoppolo. Also, Davante Adams has had two. He dropped a touchdown, and he also should have had a touchdown. They didn't challenge. I think that was 2 weeks ago. That would have been a touchdown too. So the results haven't looked great for Davante Adams, but they could look way, way, way better. I just think Jakobi Meyers is awesome and earning targets at a really high rate. And you can no longer say, well, Davante Adams is going to be the absolute 35% of the targets alpha here. I think he will be, but I can't say that with certainty. Mark, what do you think about Raiders pass catchers tonight?
Well, I think we can feel pretty confident that both Davante and Jakobi Meyers are going to be getting the targets tonight. I mean, just looking around the league, this duo is, I think, among the highest targeted duo of wide receivers in the league, kind of like a AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp type of duo where they're getting close to 60% of the targets that come from the quarterback. So, I mean, it's really hard, I think, to poke holes in their floor. In terms of ceiling, I do think just with name recognition and the history that we've seen with Davante Adams, I do think Davante is likely to be higher owned, even given the price gap, especially at captain. I think when we see these Davante games, it's 10 for 120 and 2 touchdowns. People have a lot of those in their mind. Whereas Jakobi Meyers, people, I still think sleep on him a little bit. So I think here factoring in price and how they've been used this season, you mentioned the squeaky wheel on Davante, but Jakobi was still just as involved last week, even with that. So I think comparing the two, I like Jakobi a little more just in terms of the total ownership play and the price discount you get. But I mean, it's, I'm never going to say a bad thing about Davante Adams.
Absolutely. And I actually think that for both these guys, if you have Davante captain or Jakobi captain, I think both of those are really strong plays tonight. It's a bit counterintuitive, but Raiders defense as part of those lineups works also. Defenses have their biggest games when you have a lead. And so Davante Adams having a huge game and getting the Raiders a lead could certainly help Raiders defense also. So yeah, I would not ignore defense in your Myers or Davante captain lineups. The one guy here that is the sneaky one is Trey Tucker. So Trey Tucker started to play a lot more last week, as you see, or actually over the last few weeks. We have Trey Tucker projected ahead of Hunter Renfrow. Hunter Renfrow also has all these trade rumors around him. There's at least some chance that Hunter Renfrow is a scratch or doesn't play any snaps, is up in case of emergency only tonight as they prepare for the trade deadline. Trey Tucker is their 3rd round rookie. Think he's looked fine at 600. If you're playing large field stuff, I think that is at least interesting. Gary, any thoughts on that? And then we can go to Detroit wide receiver.
Yeah, I have no issues with Trey Tucker as your cheap spend of the evening. I expect him to continue to get more work than Hunter Renfrow here. He's super cheap. We think that the Raiders are going to be having to pass, so definitely no issues with Tucker. And I think the ownership is fine there too. I wouldn't worry too much about however much he gets steamed up. If you just need to fit the 600, I think you can fit in fine. The one thing I'll say on the two main guys here, I like Jacoby also. I really love Jacoby. I think he's a great play. I just think there's a chance he gets steamed quite a bit because, and I know Cody sent us a couple notes before the show as well. And I think because it can come from two angles, right? One, it's really easy to just say, hey, I want to go down from Devontae to Jacoby from a salary perspective. The roles haven't been that dissimilar. And then two, Josh Jacobs and Jacoby, very similar price range. Cody was saying he thinks that more people look to Jacoby at the same price range than Jacobs. Maybe that's another captain Jacobs' favor. I look at it as another captain Devontae's favor, possibly. So I definitely prefer Devontae as a possible slight steam candidate. Pay up to be contrarian. Get overweight a captain play for me tonight.
Okay, let's go to Detroit here, where obviously we have Amon-Ra, but Marvin Jones is now gone. Jameson Williams got 6 more targets last week and converted none of them. There was some coach speak this week that it was just like, hey, Jameson Williams just isn't there yet, was basically what they said. Now, I don't know if that means Jameson Williams can't play here because they don't really have much else to do at the wide receiver position. Mark, why don't you talk about how we're handling Jameson from a projection perspective tonight?
He's certainly a little tough because he's still not out there running that many routes. And in week 5 in his return, he ran 50% of the team's routes. Week 6, it was down to 19%. And then week 7 up to 45%. So you mentioned he got 6 targets last week on 45% of routes. Like that's a really high target per route run number. And in his first game back, they were scheming up screen targets to him. I definitely am a little worried about him in this game, just again with the Raiders defensive design and trying to limit big plays and push everything underneath. I'm curious, like Gary's thoughts on ownership here and how he thinks the public will handle Jameson, because typically he's more of a player that I think with like the first round wide receiver draft capital, people are super excited and want to bet on the breakout with Jameson. And I've been more so fading just because, again, he's not out there that much. And the production really hasn't been there in the games that he's been active. So I'm curious if like if Gary thinks the public still seems that way or what he's thinking.
Yeah, well, he's in that classic compare him to the kickers and defense tier, right? He's 5,200. The Lions are, I think the D is 5K. Patterson's 4,800, and et cetera. So, I think that sometimes squeezes these guys out when people are more compelled to click on the DSTs and kickers. And at the end of the day, like no Marvin Jones, as we were saying, and I get that we haven't seen it necessarily there from a role perspective, but we're looking on one game, Goff at home, and I don't mind taking the shot, and I think the ownership won't get too crazy. We only have 12%. Maybe you can get a little higher than that in large field, but I don't think it's getting nuts there at 5,200.
That's my thing. At that price, it's going to be really hard for Opto Bros to find their way into him. Sim Bros will find their way into Jameson, but Opto Bros I don't think will at this price. So yeah, I think it's okay. He's not going to be out there a ton, but Goff certainly likes giving him shots and throwing to him. And for those guys who aren't aware, like these Jared Goff home road splits are real and outrageous. Like he is so much better at home throughout his entire career. I also think Josh Reynolds can play. Like, and this is just too cheap for Josh Reynolds. If this ownership holds, I'll definitely be in on Josh Reynolds. Amon-Ra looks relatively efficient to me. Maybe Gary, how do you think about Amon-Ra tonight? Because there's a lot of guys there's a few guys in this expensive range that I think project somewhat similarly, and that would include Amon-Ra in the mix here.
Yeah, I think Amon-Ra is great. Obviously, technically has the questionable tag on him. I don't think that we're worried at all.
Yeah, I think it's all stemming from the Bijan stuff. Yeah, I think
agree. So if we don't think there's any limitations there whatsoever, total ownership coming around the same as Gibbs, but I think at the end we're seeing 3 percentage points difference in Gibbs captain ownership over Amon-Ra. I think it's going to get up even higher than that. And obviously you do have to take into account price. Like throwing Gibbs at captain opens up a lot more for you than Amon-Ra does. But if you're comfortable playing some Trey Tucker type plays, I think flipping ownership on wherever they end up coming in on Amon-Ra and Gibbs is a fair approach here because ceiling cases very similar. Field's going to want to play Gibbs. In Onslaught, obviously you can play these quite a bit.
Yeah. one note about Amon-Ra captain. So if Amon-Ra is captain, we make Jared Goff optimal in flex 68% of the time. So like, and versus 53% when Amon-Ra is not the captain. Yep. In other words, you probably want Jared Goff in the flex when you have Amon-Ra, but he can get there without it. You know, we have 32% of the time Amon-Ra captain does not have Jared Goff. 68% of the time it does have Jared Goff in the flex. So I just wanted to put that out there. Tight end on this slate. This Laporta price tag and ownership makes me uncomfortable, man. And I know that Laporta has been awesome this year, especially if you throw in the qualifier for rookie tight end. But gosh, this is expensive and owned on Sam Laporta scares me plenty. Maybe I just am fudding an awesome rookie tight end. Mark, what do you think about the inputs on Laporta and how to handle him tonight?
Yeah, his role has been extremely strong. I mean, he's like top 10 in the NFL in terms of routes run at tight end. His target per route run has been strong each week. Last week, there was a little bit of a scare. Either last week or 2 weeks ago with I think it was 2 weeks ago against the Bucs with his calf. You know, he's off the injury report now. So I feel pretty good about Laporta. And if you think that Amon-Ra is limited at all in terms of his illness, then I think, you know, those targets can funnel to Laporta just over the middle of the field. And against this defense that I mentioned a few times likes to push things underneath. So from a projection standpoint, it's hard to poke many holes in Laporta at this point. I mean, his role has been really good, and you know, draft capital is there as a second round tight end. And yeah, I mean, it's really hard to say much bad about him.
Yeah. The thing that I can say bad again is price and ownership here. Gary, any thoughts on Laporta? And then we need a Michael Mayer take too, because, and I have a Michael Mayer take also, but yeah, go ahead, Gary.
Yeah. I mean, I was surprised to see almost 40% ownership on Laporta at 7,400, but I guess, you know, Phil's excited to click the guy. He's going to project well. The role has been excellent. If you're going Lions heavy stuff, I like him. If you want to mess around with some Goff captain stuff, I think I like him there too at that price where he's not all the way up to Amon-Ra, where when Amon-Ra's captain, when Amon-Ra goes off, you know, you really need a huge score where he's going to be captain. Where I think Laporta, you know, you can arguably make a case it's going to be like a 6 for 70 and a touchdown, but Goff had 3 or 4, and you kind of want Goff in the captain spot. So
let me stop you there real quick, because if you have Goff and captain, the biggest boost that you can get out of any player in your flex is Sam Laporta. In our sim, goes from 27% to 50%.
It makes sense
on Laporta if you have Goff as your captain.
Cool. Glad my intuition made sense there, because that's kind of the format.
If you listen to Utica, all you got to say is the sim is in my brain. You don't need you sims, Gary. No, the sim is in my brain. Anyway,
it's right in my brain. Always has been. On the Mayer front, yeah, I mean, glad to see him start to be more involved in this offense over the last couple of weeks, and you know, I guess eat into that condensed target tree a little bit. The price is right enough where I don't mind going there. Still at sub 4K. That's right around like Raiders defense number. I'd rather take the shot on the Mayer offense of it all. But Garoppolo back, I really like playing into the 2 main Raiders receivers tonight. And so maybe that just kind of gives me a little bit of a thumbs down on Mayer, but I don't have an issue with it either.
Yeah. So I just want to point out on Mayer, I know it didn't look good last week, and even the underlying stuff didn't look good. They pulled all the starters, and Mayer was part of them. So I thought that was, you know, encouraging. Like, they consider Mayer their full-blown tight end. When they pull the starters, they pulled Michael Mayer. So I'm interested in Mayer tonight. This ownership looks a little hot to me, but I'm still interested in Mr. Mayer tonight. Mark, any thoughts on tight end before we move on?
I'll compare his role to Laporta's a bit. Just like Mayer, you know, when he was the starter a couple weeks ago, he only got up to 67% of routes, and like Laporta, as I mentioned, is top 10 in routes at 77%. So we want to see, you know, the elite tight ends are running 80% more routes, and like the absolute tippy top is 90%. So he's still around that. I would imagine he'll be in the 65 to 75% route range, and then Austin Hooper takes up the other portion. So it's not an amazing role for Mayer. I'm a little biased. I've known Mayer's sister. He's from Northern Kentucky. I've known his sister since high school, so I've been rooting for him for a while. So I do like him in that regard, and hope like he does well. But in terms of his role, it's not an amazing tight end 1 role, but it is decent. And obviously with the price gap, you know, down almost half of what Laporta costs, I think it's a decent play.
Okay. Breaking news into the show. I'm only bringing this up because Gary's on the show.
Yeah, I see it.
Seahawks get defensive tackle Leonard Williams. Giants get bunch of draft picks, including a 2024 second rounder. So well done by the Giants. I mean,
good job, Joe Shane.
More teams should be trading away players, become sellers like they do at the baseball deadline for future assets. Anyways.
Excellent work.
Before we get to defense and kicker, I did want to touch on this note from Eric. So I saw this also, and I definitely think that it's at least worth noting. Craig Reynolds, didn't even know Craig Reynolds was going to play last week, ends up playing, but was way, way, way behind Gibbs. Mark, maybe we can talk about how we're projecting Reynolds' role tonight, and do you think there's room for us to be wrong there and move it up?
Yeah, I think we have him for about, like a quarter of the carries projected for the Lions. His pass game role is certainly a lot worse than Gibbs. So I think that is kind of why the projection doesn't look great at all. Like most of our projection is just carry based. And obviously on PPR DraftKings, catches are worth so much more than carries. So it's certainly, without a touchdown, I don't really see him being all that relevant, but certainly that could happen if he's in there on a drive or at the goal line if Gibbs gets banged up or something. But yeah, projection wise, it's about a fourth of the carries and very minimal target share.
I don't think that they'll like straight pull Gibbs for Reynolds around the goal line, but if they get a timeout or something and they come back and the ball's at like the 3-yard line, would not surprise me to see them bring in Craig Reynolds for that carry. So yeah, I think that's worth noting. Good call, Eric T. Dustin says, can you play Gibbs and Reynolds in the same lineup for tourney? I wouldn't do it at captain. I can see exactly how bad that is, but in flex, I think it's okay. What do you think, Gary?
Yeah, in flex, it's fine. Reynolds at 3,200 is just a little bit overpriced enough where I think the field might be off him. I mean, 13% total ownership is fine with me. I like him particularly because he's a pivot, right? He's a pivot to the chalkiest play on the slate. So when I play him, I probably don't want to play Gibbs, but I'm not ruling it out, especially if I was MMEing. I don't want to rule that out, but I agree with you on captain.
Okay. All right, let's go to kicker and defense, and then we'll take a few questions from you guys before the flag plans. Kickers, once again, are a bit overpriced here. 4,800, Riley Patterson. 4,200, Daniel Carlson. Definitely overpriced, in my opinion, relative to their ceiling. Does not mean that you should not at least think about including them in your lineups. I do think that overall, and especially in the lottos, like kicker and defense are underplayed often in the lotto just because it's not fun to click on them. It's just not fun. And people want to root not for defense or kicker, but for actual players. Mark, any defense or kicker takes here tonight?
Not a whole lot. I did notice that Daniel Carlson is listed on the injury report with a groin injury. Obviously not great for kickers, but they haven't signed anyone else to their active roster to kick behind him. So I think, he should be fine, but I thought that was at least somewhat noteworthy. And when I was thinking about this, Josh McDaniels has shown us he loves to kick field goals, even when it's just an absolutely horrible decision. So I can't, sometimes we can see like teams fall behind and really go for it on fourth down and avoid the kickers, but I don't think that's necessarily in Josh McDaniels' repertoire at this point. So I don't really have too much of a take on kickers though.
I mean, the thing to me is we should always be comparing the players around them in salary to their ceiling. So like if you think you can get more from Jameson Williams, you think you can get more from Michael Mayer or Craig Reynolds or Khalif Raymond, like those are the guys that have to beat Carlson and Patterson for it to make sense. So that's what I would be thinking through. Gary, any thoughts on kicker and defense before we move on here?
Yeah, but you nailed it there. I mean, kickers, a little bit too expensive is what we've seen now for 4 or 5 straight weeks. Yet we are coming off 2 straight showdown slates where kickers were optimal. Dicker last night, Greg Joseph last Monday night. So these guys are still getting there in the right script. So you shouldn't be ruling them out just because they're overpriced. But I agree comparing them. I like Jameson Williams and Michael Mayer better than these spots tonight. From a defense perspective, Cody's always the one breaking these down. So I don't want to sound like I'm any expert here, but the Lions certainly project well. You're seeing some ownership there. Their defense has been very good this year. Garoppolo's leading the league in interceptions. You're thinking that the Raiders are going to have to drop back. Like to me, especially in onslaught stuff, it does not seem like the Lions are going to be a bad play.
Yeah. And I believe Frank Ragnow is out tonight for the Lions. And I think one more offensive lineman is out.
Yeah, Jonah Jackson, their guard, is also out.
Okay. So they're missing 2 offensive linemen. Obviously, the Raiders have Max Crosby. Like, you can find a ceiling on these defenses. Sometimes I just like playing them when they're cheap and lightly owned. That will be Raiders tonight. That will not be Lions. Lions are expensive and will be owned. Okay. Take a few questions here before we get to the flag plants. You guys can drop in as many as you want. Let's see here. Oh, I think we had a FanDuel question. I want to ignore my FanDuel brothers. I've mostly been playing on FanDuel lately as well, although not for Showdown. I only play Showdown on DraftKings. But let's see if we can get an answer here for Troy, my FanDuel brother. Okay, we have not been able to flip the table yet. I'll tell those guys too. But any takes here, Adams or Jimmy G, raw points on FanDuel. On DraftKings, we have Adams 19, Jimmy G 16.6.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be closer, right, on FanDuel for Jimmy G to Adams, obviously, without full point PPR. I would still lean Adams. I think when this offense is clicking, you're still looking at 100 yards, probably, especially if they're in this game or winning it, 100 yards, probably at least one touchdown, if not multiple for Adams. And I'd take that over the Jimmy G side of things, but certainly much closer.
Okay. All right. Let's see what we got here. Joe says, seems like I've been seeing double QB lineups winning way more often lately. Is that actually viable? Oh, yeah. I mean, Cody's done a ton of work on this where both quarterbacks are often right. It's certainly the highest floor play to play both quarterbacks typically on most slates. Gary, any thoughts on double QB lineups here with Goff and Garoppolo?
Yeah, I think for cash, you want it almost always. From a winning perspective, probably is seen more than it is even from a perfect lineup or a viable perspective. I haven't done that research directly, but certainly, when it could fit, both your quarterbacks on most slates are going to be your highest floor ceiling combo plays. Sometimes your receivers will be your highest ceiling plays, but not necessarily your highest floor ceiling combo plays. So I totally, I think double quarterback lineups are always going to be in play, especially when you're picking like an over environment.
Edwin says, can we please have access beyond the paywall to all players' info on the Sims? We'll happily pay for it. Feels so important to Showdown. Yeah. So we've been talking about this and spending a lot of time. We are very conscious about not really messing up the Showdown ecosystem. And, there's some stuff in Sims for Showdown that I think is very dangerous to share with the public. So yeah, we're going to do something with the Sims Showdown stuff. We'll have an announcement on it. I don't want to put a timeline on it, but yeah, we're certainly thinking through that and totally get it. Edwin. Dustin says, when playing MME, does it make sense to rule out specific builds completely? Example, 3-3 build or 4-2 Lions bid. I would not rule that stuff out, but I do think it's typically thinking through on Showdown. Like, if you think one of these that we have here is like going to be massively over-owned or massively under-owned. And there's been slates where I'm like, man, 5-1 is going to be really low here. And I think this team could absolutely crush. And I want to play a bunch of 5-1 stuff. And maybe in that, I would tell the opto, tell the solver or whatever, just be like, hey, I want a ton of 5-1 lineups here. And I think that's totally fine. But in terms of grouping it out, Gary, I don't think that's something that we want to do, right?
No, definitely not. And I'm a pretty aggressive player where I like taking big leverage stance, but you just take the leverage stance on the constructions themselves. You don't fully rule them out. I mean, there's a reason that 3-3s and 4-2s are going to be the most owned. It's not just because people want to click on those players. It's because they're going to project the best as well. So you can't rule out the best projecting type of constructions. You can get under the field and overweight on some other ones, but you don't want to fully rule them out, especially in MME.
I got to take this as a personal one. David Lazowski, Adam, it's Laz Gets Fit. Appreciate the content. Laz, I've been trying to get in touch with you for no less than 5 years. I have not been able to do so. You are one of my all-time heroes. Laz won the Thunderdome yesterday. Shout out with an awesome lineup. Congrats to Laz on that one. Honestly, for a while, Laz, I didn't know if you were a real person or not. I'm so glad to actually see that you are. Please, please, please get in touch with me, Twitter or adam@establishedrun.com. Yeah, so glad to meet you, Laz. Okay, sorry for that rant there. That
it's exciting.
Absolutely made my day. Okay. Single entry small field, are you playing close to the cash lineup? Absolutely not. I'm trying to get weird in Showdown. I mean, the whole goal is to make good lineups that aren't duped, and anything close to cash is going to be duped. Anything that is in like the top 10, 20, 30 lineups and optimals is going to be duped. And I think like thinking about product ownership too is a really good way to think about avoiding dupes. In other words, product ownership, if it's lower, is way like less likely to be duped. So that's something that I'm always thinking through.
You mentioned earlier that you think Gibbs will be really steamed, especially in the single entry 3 max stuff. And I agree with that. I'm curious, second, who you guys think it'll be. Do you think Devontae is like the second most likely as captain who in the smaller stuff? Cause that's what I play. I know Gary's more MME, but in the smaller stuff, I'm curious, like who you think like the second behind him will be with Gibbs being so popular. I don't know if it would be like Amon-Ra as leverage or if people will just kind of go to the Raiders passing game.
Yeah. We have Amon-Ra as the next one. I think in Gibbs lineups, people won't play Goff as much. So I would probably say one of Amon-Ra or Devontae would probably be the next most owned in small field.
I think that's right. I know you were saying you like Jacoby, and I think Jacoby has the best chance of getting steamed in a large field. I think in small field, people are going to still want to click Amon-Ra or Devontae. I think that's kind of guesswork on my part.
All right. Sorry, guys. Last one we'll get to here today. Dustin says total ownership for mains is preferable under 125. Do you cap your ownership during MME runs in Showdown, Gary? I would think that would be a mistake, but yeah, what do you think about capping ownership?
I do not. Sometimes I'll work with Cody when I am MMEing, which, by the way, full transparency, with the baby, I've not had a chance to MME many Showdown slates this year, so I haven't gotten to really mess around with new salary stuff with kickers and everything like that and what that looks like. But historically, in years past when I was doing it, no, especially for Showdown slates, everything is so variant. You want to be able to leave tons of money on the table. Sometimes that'll get weird with ownership cap numbers. It's more about the rules you set, the correlations you set, and the boosts and docks that you set. It's not really about total ownership for me on Showdown.
All right, we've said it all. We may have said too much, even probably said too much, but nobody cares because it is time for the flag plan portion of the program. The entire board is, of course, open here. I'll go to our honored guest here, Mark, first for the flag plan.
I'm a little torn because I probably would have gone Jacoby here, but with Gary saying he thinks he's going to get steamed, and I think his logic makes sense just given the price points around him. And I do like Gibbs, but think he's going to be so popular that I can't plant him. And so I'm going to go with Amon-Ra St. Brown as my flag plan. I just think this guy is built so different. I mean, he's absolutely elite at the position. He's getting over 30% of the targets this year. I think with the way the Raiders play defense, it just sets up perfectly for Amon-Ra to eat. And with so much ownership going towards Gibbs and the captain, I really do think Gary set it up well earlier in the show when he said, as long, if Gibbs doesn't get the touchdowns we saw in that game where they weren't trailing, he didn't get many targets, which I think is a sharp point. He got a ton of targets last week against the Ravens in a trailing game script, and this week is set up to go differently. So I think Amon-Ra here is my target, hopefully, or is my flag plant. Hopefully he gets some touchdowns and into the end zone. And I also need him in fantasy. So a little double dip here for me rooting wise.
Yeah, we have Amon-Ra optimal at captain around 16 or 17% of the time right now. And we have captain ownership projected around 14%. So, slightly plus EV on Amon-Ra captain stuff here tonight.
I do think too, just with the single game stuff, like the illness might scare, another 1% of people off him or something as well. When everyone's looking for edges on these one game slates.
All right, Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, I hate to double down on two of the top 10 receivers in football here. And it's not like these are guys that are going to be faded, being faded by the field in any way. I like the Amon-Ra call as well. But I'm just going to slide over that Devontae Adams squeaky wheel narrative one more week. He gets Jimmy Garoppolo back. They should be playing from behind here. I think that they really do want one of those big 15-plus target games. I think he does operate as leverage to Jahmyr Gibbs chalk from an ownership perspective at captain. And I like Gibbs, and I don't think he's bad chalk, but I want him in the flex more often than not. And I want to take one of these Raiders guys in my captain spot, even in Lions heavy builds, just for how I expect this game to go tonight. So give me Devontae Adams as my flag plant tonight. Thought about Jacobs, but I've gotten burned by that play too many times. And I want to have a short memory, but I think Devontae is the guy tonight.
All right. Amon-Ra and Devontae. You guys took some of the obvious best ones on the entire slate. Let me go a little bit further off the board here. I am going to go down to Mr. Josh Reynolds. I think I want to lean into the Jared Goff home road splits. I mean, it is so drastic how much better he plays at home. I also want to lean into Marvin Jones being out. I want to lean into how poor of a game Jameson Williams had last week, and maybe that's sticky with his role going forward. And I also want to lean into the chemistry, the shower narrative. These guys, Jared Goff and Josh Reynolds, played together with the Rams, presumably showered together a ton with the Rams. And now they go together to Detroit, and these guys have had some really big games together also. And so I think like a way that you can go for a Gibbs fade is with Amon-Ra, Josh Reynolds, Jared Goff scoring all the touchdowns. And like that doesn't happen that often. But if Gibbs is going to be 80-90% in some of the stuff that I'm playing tonight, it's probably a bet that I'm going to at least think about taking. So yeah, Josh Reynolds for me. All right. And by the way, we only have Josh Reynolds optimal around 2.5% of the time as your captain. So I'm not sure I'm going to play Josh Reynolds in captain, but I think more in flex, especially for small field stuff. All right. That is going to do it for this Monday Night Football Showdown breakdown. Later, we will have on the site all the sim analysis for anybody who is an in-season subscriber. Also, Cody is away, but is still working on the ownership stuff. And Mark and Jack will, of course, and Leone will, of course, be on the projection updates as well. So stay tuned to all the content for updates before lock tonight. Appreciate all of you. It's fun being back here on the YouTube streets with you all. For Mark, for Gary, for our hero, Laz Gets Fits, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.